The wooden doors of the courtroom creaked open, and the steady hum of low conversation faded into tense silence. The room was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their notepads and cameras at the ready. Spectators filled the benches, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet judgment. At the defense table sat Taylor Brooks. Dark brown skin, sharp cheekbones, and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. Her long black hair was pulled back into a neat ponytail, and her fitted black suit and crisp white blouse gave her the appearance of quiet authority. Taylor's hands were folded calmly on the table in front of her. Her face was an unreadable mask of calm, but beneath it, a storm was building. Across the room, at the prosecution's table, sat Officer Brian Keller. He was in his mid-30s, tall, and broad-shouldered with short blonde hair and cold blue eyes. His police uniform was crisp and freshly pressed. His badge gleamed under the fluorescent lights. He leaned back in his chair, his arms crossed over his chest, his mouth curled into a faint smirk. Keller's lawyer, Philip Mason, sat beside him, mid-40s, expensive gray suit, salt and pepper hair combed neatly back. His expression was one of quiet confidence. He leaned toward Keller. "Relax. This won't take long." Keller's smirk widened. "I'm not worried." Taylor's lawyer, David Langston, leaned toward her. He was tall and calm, with dark hair and sharp brown eyes. "They think this is over." Taylor's dark eyes remained steady on Keller. "Let them think that." Judge Richard Holloway entered the courtroom and settled into the high-backed chair at the front of the room. He was in his late 60s, with thinning white hair and a permanent scowl. He adjusted his glasses and looked toward the bailiff. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The room stood. "You may be seated," Judge Holloway said. His sharp blue gaze settled on Taylor. "Miss Brooks, you are charged with obstruction of justice, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer. How do you plead?" David stood. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Keller's smirk widened. Judge Holloway's mouth curled downward. "Proceed with opening statements." Philip Mason rose, adjusting his suit jacket as he approached the jury box. His smile was thin and practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mason began, his voice measured, "this is not a complicated case. Officer Brian Keller was conducting a lawful traffic stop when Miss Brooks interfered. She became aggressive. She resisted arrest. And when Officer Keller attempted to de-escalate the situation, Miss Brooks physically assaulted him." Taylor's jaw tightened. Mason smiled faintly. "The evidence will show that Officer Keller acted professionally and within the bounds of the law. Unfortunately, Miss Brooks chose to escalate the situation. That's why we're here today, for accountability." Taylor's eyes darkened. Mason's smile widened slightly. "Thank you." David stood calmly and approached the jury. His expression was measured, his voice even. "Ladies and gentlemen," David began, "Officer Keller's story is compelling. But there's just one problem. It isn't true." Keller's smirk faltered slightly. David's eyes sharpened. "My client, Miss Brooks, was not interfering with an investigation. She was not aggressive. She did not resist arrest. And she most certainly did not assault Officer Keller." David stepped closer. "Officer Keller is not here because he was threatened. He's here because he feels untouchable." Mason stood. "Objection. Overruled," Judge Holloway said. David smiled faintly. "We'll show you the truth. And when you see it, you'll understand why these charges never should have been brought forward." Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. "Prosecution, call your first witness." Mason smiled thinly. "The state calls Officer Brian Keller to the stand." Keller stood, adjusting his uniform before stepping toward the stand. He took the oath and sat down with practiced ease. His smirk remained as he adjusted the microphone. "Officer Keller," Mason began, "please describe the events that led to Miss Brooks's arrest." Keller's smile widened. "I was conducting a traffic stop near 5th and Lexington. The vehicle was in violation of several traffic laws. While I was speaking with the driver, Miss Brooks approached me aggressively." Mason nodded. "Aggressively how?" "She raised her voice. She refused to comply when I asked her to step back. And when I attempted to escort her away from the scene, she resisted and shoved me." Gasps rippled through the gallery. David's eyes narrowed. "And what happened next?" Mason pressed. Keller's gaze sharpened. She swung at me. I had no choice but to restrain her. Did you use excessive force? Of course not. And you filed a formal incident report? Yes. Mason smiled. No further questions. David stood slowly. His eyes darkened as he approached the stand. Officer Keller, David began, you stated that Miss Brooks approached you during a lawful traffic stop? Yes. David's brow lifted. And you identified yourself? Yes. David's smile widened faintly. Did you activate your body cam? Keller hesitated. It malfunctioned. David's gaze sharpened. Malfunctioned? Yes. David smiled coldly. That's convenient. Keller's jaw tightened. David's eyes narrowed. So you have no audio or visual evidence to support your version of events? Keller's mouth twisted. My word is evidence. David's gaze sharpened. Is it? Keller's mouth tightened. David leaned closer. You stated that Miss Brooks shoved you? Yes. Do you have any physical evidence to support that? Keller's mouth pressed into a thin line. No. David's smile was cold. No bruces? No marks? No. David's gaze darkened. Interesting. Keller's jaw clenched. David stepped back. No further questions. Keller's smirk had faded. His shoulders were tense as he stepped down from the stand. Taylor's dark eyes followed him as he sat back down. David leaned toward her. They think they've got this. Taylor's smile was faint. Not for long. The following morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than before. The story was already making waves in the local media. White cop faces off against black woman in high-stakes trial. Reporters sat poised with their notepads and cameras, ready to capture the next explosive moment. Taylor Brooks walked into the courtroom with the same composed grace as before. Her black heels clicked sharply against the marble floor as she took her seat at the defense table. Her dark eyes were calm, her posture straight and poised. Across the room, Officer Brian Keller was already seated at the prosecution's table. He leaned back in his chair, his uniform crisp and his badge gleaming. His smirk hadn't faded. In fact, it seemed even more self-assured. His lawyer, Philip Mason, sat beside him, flipping through a thick file of notes. David Langston leaned toward Taylor as they sat down. They're too comfortable. Good, Taylor replied softly. The fall will hurt more. Judge Richard Holloway entered the courtroom, adjusting his glasses as he settled into his chair. Court is now in session, the bailiff announced. Judge Holloway's sharp blue gaze settled on Philip Mason. Proceed. Philip stood, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the jury box. His smile was thin and polished. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to call its next witness, Officer Heather Mallory. David's jaw tightened. Of course. Heather Mallory was Keller's longtime partner. She was tall, blonde, and fit, wearing her police uniform like a shield. She walked toward the stand with confident strides, taking the oath and settling into the witness chair. Philip smiled. Officer Mallory, you were present at the scene during Officer Keller's encounter with Miss Brooks? Yes, Mallory said, her voice sharp and professional. And what did you see? Mallory's gaze sharpened as she glanced toward Taylor. Miss Brooks approached Officer Keller while he was conducting a lawful traffic stop. She was aggressive, raised her voice, refused to comply with instructions. Taylor's brow lifted slightly. Philip nodded. And how did Officer Keller respond? He remained calm. He attempted to de-escalate the situation. And what happened next? Mallory's expression darkened. Miss Brooks shoved Officer Keller. Gasps rippled through the gallery. David's jaw tightened. And did Officer Keller use excessive force? Philip pressed. Mallory's mouth curled slightly. Of course not. Philip smiled. No further questions. David stood. His movements were smooth and deliberate as he approached the stand. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold and sharp. Officer Mallory, David began, you stated that Miss Brooks approached Officer Keller aggressively? Yes. David's brow lifted. And you were where? Standing near the patrol car. David's gaze sharpened. About how far from where the incident occurred? Mallory hesitated. 15 feet, maybe 20. David's smile widened faintly. 15 feet. And you could clearly hear their conversation? Mallory's mouth tightened. Yes. David's brow lifted. Through the noise of street traffic, Mallory's jaw clenched. Yes. David's eyes narrowed. Interesting, because the body cam footage that Officer Keller submitted shows significant background noise, including passing cars and voices from nearby pedestrians. Mallory's expression darkened. I have sharp hearing. David's smile sharpened. Lucky you. Mallory's gaze hardened. David stepped closer. You testified that Miss Brooks shoved Officer Keller? Yes. David tilted his head. Was that caught on camera? Mallory's mouth tightened. No. David's smile widened faintly. Why not? Mallory's gaze sharpened. The camera malfunctioned. David's brow lifted. Another malfunction? Mallory's jaw clenched. David's gaze darkened. So you're telling the court that Officer Keller's body cam and your body cam both malfunctioned at the exact same time? Mallory's mouth tightened. It happens. David's gaze sharpened. Does it? Mallory's jaw flexed. David's smile was cold. Did you personally see Miss Brooks's hand make contact with Officer Keller? Mallory hesitated. I saw the motion. David's brow lifted. You saw the motion, but not the contact. Mallory's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David's gaze hardened. Did you see the physical contact? Mallory's gaze flicked toward Keller. Not directly. David's brow lifted. Not directly. Mallory's jaw tightened. David smiled faintly. No further questions. Mallory stepped down from the stand, her face tight and pale. She avoided Keller's gaze as she sat down. Keller's smirk had thinned slightly. His posture was still relaxed, but his shoulders were more rigid now. Philip stood. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce Officer Keller's written incident report as evidence. David's smile widened faintly. We have no objection. Judge Holloway nodded. Proceed. Philip approached the table and handed the report to the bailiff. David leaned toward Taylor. He's walking into the trap. Taylor's eyes gleamed coldly. I know. Philip smiled as the report was handed to Judge Holloway. The report details the events as Officer Keller described them, including the alleged assault. David stood. Permission to cross-examine Officer Keller about the report? Proceed, Judge Holloway said. David approached Keller slowly. Officer Keller, you submitted this report immediately after the incident? Yes. David's brow lifted. And this was based on your personal recollection? Yes. David smiled faintly. And you're certain that it's accurate? Absolutely. David's smile widened coldly. Interesting. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out another document. He handed it to the bailiff. This, David said smoothly, is a forensic analysis of Officer Keller's body cam log files. Keller's eyes narrowed. David's gaze sharpened. It shows that the body cam wasn't malfunctioning. It was manually deactivated. Gasps erupted through the room. Keller's face paled. David's voice was cutting. Did you manually deactivate your body cam, Officer Keller? Keller's jaw tightened. No. David's brow lifted. Then why does the log show a manual override? Keller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. David's gaze darkened. Did you deactivate your camera to cover up the fact that Miss Brooks never touched you? Keller's face was red now. No. David's smile widened. No further questions. Keller stood slowly and walked back toward the prosecution's table. His hands were clenched into fists. Taylor's dark eyes followed him. David sat down beside her. Now it's getting interesting. Taylor's smile sharpened. Let's see how long that smirk lasts. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The gallery was filled with curious onlookers and reporters, the soft hum of whispered conversations mixing with the low click of camera shutters. The air felt heavy, as though the weight of the truth was pressing down on the room. Taylor Brooks sat calmly at the defense table, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly on the polished wood surface. Her dark eyes were steady as she watched Officer Brian Keller shift uncomfortably at the prosecution's table. His once smug expression had thinned into a tight, defensive mask. His lawyer, Philip Mason, sat beside him, whispering furiously. David Langston leaned toward Taylor. He's unraveling. Taylor's lips curled faintly. Good. Judge Richard Holloway adjusted his glasses as he settled back into his chair. "Mr. Langston," the judge said, his tone even but sharp, "you may proceed with the cross-examination." David stood smoothly. His movements were slow and deliberate as he approached the witness stand. His gaze sharpened as it settled on Keller. "Officer Keller," David began, "you testified that your body cam malfunctioned during the incident?" Keller's jaw tightened. "Yes." David's brow lifted. "And you're certain of that?" "Yes." David pulled a thin sheet of paper from his folder and handed it to the bailiff. "Your Honor, this is a forensic analysis of Officer Keller's body cam system log. It shows that the body cam was manually disabled, not malfunctioning." Gasps erupted through the gallery. Keller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. David's gaze sharpened. "Officer Keller, why would you manually disable your body cam?" Keller's face flushed red. "It was an accident." David's brow lifted. "An accident?" "Yes." David's smile widened faintly. "Do you know how many steps it takes to manually disable a body cam?" Keller's mouth twisted. David's eyes narrowed. "3. It takes 3 separate steps, including a password override." Keller's jaw tightened. "It was a mistake." David's smile sharpened. "So you expect the court to believe that you accidentally entered your override code and shut off your body cam during an incident where you later accused Miss Brooks of assaulting you?" Keller's eyes flashed. "It happens." David's gaze darkened. "No, it doesn't." Keller's hands curled into fists. His face was red now, his breathing sharp and shallow. David's smile was thin and cold. "But let's not rely on the body cam, shall we?" David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin USB drive. He walked toward the court's media console and inserted the drive. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. "Exhibit D," David said smoothly. The screen showed a grainy black and white video from a security camera mounted on the exterior of the Lexington shopping plaza. The timestamp in the corner matched the time of the alleged incident. The footage showed Keller standing beside his patrol car. Taylor was several feet away, standing calmly with her arms crossed. Keller stepped toward her, fast and aggressive. Keller's voice stepped back. Taylor remained calm. Her hands stayed at her sides. "Keller," stepping closer, "did you hear me?" Taylor said something, her lips moving in a calm and measured tone. Then, Keller grabbed Taylor's arm. Gasps filled the room. David's smile widened faintly. "Wait for it." On the video, Taylor pulled her arm back, but not in an aggressive way. Keller stepped toward her again, and then, suddenly, he stumbled backward as though pushed. But Taylor's hands never touched him. David froze the video. "You claim that Miss Brooks shoved you," David said coldly. "But this footage clearly shows that no physical contact occurred." Keller's face flushed deep red. That's not." David's gaze darkened. "Not what? Not what happened? Or not what you expected to be caught on tape?" Keller's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David's gaze sharpened. No further questions. David returned to the defense table. Keller sat frozen at the prosecution's table, his mouth twisted into a hard line. Philip Mason stood quickly, adjusting his jacket as he walked toward the stand. "Officer Keller, care to clarify what happened in that video?" Keller's jaw tightened. "The footage doesn't tell the whole story." Philip's brow lifted. "Really?" Keller's mouth curled into a defensive sneer. "She was aggressive. Maybe it doesn't look like it on video, but you had to be there." David's smile was faint. "Oh, but you were there, and so were several other people." David stood and pulled a thin file from his briefcase. "Your Honor, the defense would like to introduce sworn statements from 5 separate witnesses, all of whom were present at the scene." Judge Holloway's eyes narrowed. "Proceed." David handed the file to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. David's voice was calm and cold. "Each of these witnesses states that Officer Keller initiated physical contact with Miss Brooks. Each of them states that Miss Brooks never raised her voice or acted aggressively. And each of them states that Officer Keller appeared angry, not threatened." Keller's face burned red. Philip's mouth twisted. "Objection. Overruled," Judge Holloway said coldly. David's smile sharpened. "So, Officer Keller, would you like to revise your testimony?" Keller's mouth curled into a sneer. "I stand by my statement." David's gaze darkened. "Even though it's been proven false." Keller's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David's smile widened. No further questions. Keller sat down stiffly, his face pale and drawn. Philip leaned toward him, whispering urgently. Keller's jaw tightened. David leaned toward Taylor. He's losing control. Taylor's dark eyes gleamed coldly. Let him. Judge Holloway's gavel struck the bench. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning. As the room emptied, Keller shot Taylor a hard look. His eyes burned with anger. You think you're clever? Keller hissed. This isn't over. Taylor's smile was cold. You're right. Keller's mouth twisted into a scowl. You have no idea what you've started. Taylor's gaze darkened. Neither do you. David smiled faintly as Keller stormed out of the room. He's going to crack. Taylor's smile sharpened. That's the idea. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. The gallery was packed, reporters, spectators, and curious onlookers sitting shoulder to shoulder. The story had exploded across the news. White cop accused of framing black woman. The headlines were brutal. Taylor Brooks sat at the defense table with quiet poise. Her dark eyes were cold and calculating as they followed Officer Brian Keller, who sat rigid at the prosecution's table. His once confident smirk was gone, replaced by a hard line of tension along his jaw. His lawyer, Philip Mason, sat beside him, flipping furiously through a stack of notes. David Langston leaned toward Taylor. He's breaking. Taylor's lips curled faintly. Not yet. Judge Richard Holloway adjusted his glasses. Mr. Langston, you may proceed with the next witness. David stood smoothly, buttoning his jacket as he walked toward the witness stand. His movements were slow and deliberate, a predator circling its prey. The defense would like to call Officer Brian Keller back to the stand. Keller's jaw tightened. His knuckles whitened as he stood and walked toward the stand. He sat down, his expression hard and defensive. The bailiff swore him in. David smiled faintly. Officer Keller, you testified earlier that Miss Brooks was aggressive during your encounter. Yes. And you claimed that Miss Brooks shoved you? Yes. David's brow lifted. Even though the video footage clearly showed that no physical contact occurred, Keller's mouth curled. The video doesn't show everything. David's gaze darkened. Doesn't it? Keller's eyes narrowed. I know what happened. David smiled coldly. Of course you do. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thin file. He handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Holloway. Your Honor, David said smoothly, these are Officer Keller's disciplinary records. Keller's eyes widened. David's smile sharpened. Notice the pattern? Judge Holloway flipped through the file, his gaze hardening. David's voice sharpened. Officer Keller has been the subject of 7 complaints of excessive force over the last 3 years. Gasps filled the courtroom. David's smile widened faintly. None of those complaints were investigated internally. Philip Mason shot to his feet. Objection. Overruled, Judge Holloway said coldly. Philip's face paled. David stepped toward Keller. How did you manage to avoid disciplinary action? Keller's jaw tightened. I did my job. David's brow lifted. You did your job by using excessive force. Keller's mouth curled into a defensive sneer. Sometimes force is necessary. David's gaze sharpened. Really? Let's take a closer look. David walked toward the media console and inserted a flash drive. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered to life. Exhibit, David said. The video showed Keller in a different encounter from 2 months earlier. Keller's voice, get down. A young black man stood with his hands raised. Keller shoved him face first into the pavement. The sound of the impact echoed through the courtroom. Gasps erupted through the gallery. David froze the video. His gaze darkened. This man was unarmed. He complied with your instructions, and you still assaulted him. Keller's mouth twisted. He was resisting. David smiled coldly. Resisting? Or just black? Philip shot to his feet. Objection. Overruled. Judge Holloway's tone was cutting. David's gaze sharpened. Officer Keller, would you like to revise your testimony? Keller's mouth opened, but nothing came out. David's smile sharpened. No further questions. Keller sat frozen on the stand, his face pale. His hands were curled into fists. His lawyer leaned toward him, whispering urgently, but Keller's eyes were locked on Taylor. David turned toward the jury. The defense rests. Judge Holloway's gaze darkened. Officer Keller, you may step down. Keller's jaw tightened as he stood. His eyes burned with anger as he walked back toward the prosecution's table. Taylor's gaze followed him calmly. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. Mr. Mason, do you wish to redirect? Philip's face was tight. No, Your Honor. Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. Then I believe we are ready for closing arguments. David stood. His gaze swept over the jury, his expression calm and confident. Ladies and gentlemen, David began. Officer Keller's version of events has collapsed under the weight of evidence. The video doesn't lie. The witnesses don't lie. But Officer Keller, he lied. David's gaze sharpened. This case was never about public safety. It was about control. Officer Keller thought he could fabricate an assault charge against my client because he assumed no one would question his authority. David's eyes darkened. But authority is not above accountability. David's voice dropped into a quiet intensity. You have seen the evidence. You have heard the testimony. Now it is time for justice. David stepped back. Thank you. Philip stood slowly, adjusting his tie as he approached the jury box. His smile was thin. Ladies and gentlemen, Officer Keller has a long and distinguished record of service. He made a mistake, but that does not mean he should be condemned for it. Philip's smile widened faintly. Justice should not be defined by a single incident. Philip stepped back. Thank you. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. Court is adjourned until tomorrow morning for the verdict. As the gallery emptied, Keller walked toward Taylor. His eyes were dark with rage. You think you've won? Keller hissed. Taylor's smile was faint. I don't think I know. Keller's mouth twisted. You have no idea who you're messing with. Taylor's gaze sharpened. Neither do you. Keller's jaw clenched as he walked out of the courtroom, his shoulders rigid with anger. David leaned toward Taylor. You think the jury saw through him? Taylor's dark eyes gleamed. They didn't just see through him, they saw the truth. David's smile widened. Then this is over. Taylor's smile sharpened. Not yet. 1 week later, the front page of the Washington Post read, Officer Keller found guilty of perjury and assault, sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. Below the headline was a photo of Keller being led away in handcuffs. Taylor sat in her office, her hands resting lightly on her desk. David sat across from her. David's smile widened. So what's next? Taylor's dark eyes flashed. We find out who covered for him. David's brow lifted. You think this goes higher? Taylor's gaze sharpened. It always does. The courtroom was thick with tension. The gallery was filled with quiet murmurs as the jury filed back into their seats. All eyes were focused on the foreman, a middle-aged woman with sharp blue eyes and a composed expression. Taylor Brooks sat calmly at the defense table, her hands folded on the polished surface. Her dark eyes were steady as she watched Officer Brian Keller sitting stiffly at the prosecution's table. His face was pale and drawn. His usual smug expression had been stripped away, replaced by a hard line of barely concealed fear. Philip Mason sat beside Keller, his face tight with quiet frustration. His hands were clasped tightly together on the table, his knuckles white. David Langston leaned toward Taylor. You feel that? Taylor's lips curled faintly. That's the weight of justice. Judge Richard Holloway settled into his chair. His gaze was hard and cold. Will the defendant please rise? Keller stood slowly, his shoulders tense, his gaze darting toward the jury box. Judge Holloway's gaze swept toward the jury foreman. Has the jury reached a verdict? The foreman stood. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Holloway nodded. Please read the verdict. The foreman unfolded a small sheet of paper and cleared her throat. In the case of the state versus Brian Keller, on the charge of perjury, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled through the room. Keller's face paled. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant guilty. A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Keller's mouth opened, but no sound came out. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. David's smile widened faintly. Keller's fists clenched. Philip Mason shot to his feet. Your Honor, we request an immediate appeal. Denied, Judge Holloway said coldly. Officer Keller is hereby remanded into federal custody pending sentencing. Keller's mouth twisted. You can't do this. Judge Holloway's gaze sharpened. I can, and I just did. Two bailiffs approached Keller. His shoulders stiffened. You think this is over? Keller snarled as the bailiffs gripped his arms. Taylor's dark eyes gleamed coldly. It's over for you. Keller's mouth curled into a sneer. I have friends. Powerful friends. You think you've won? Taylor's smile sharpened. You don't have enough friends. Keller thrashed violently as the bailiffs pulled him toward the side exit. You're going to regret this. Taylor's gaze remained steady. No, but you will. Keller's furious protests echoed through the room as the bailiffs dragged him out of sight. Judge Holloway's gaze hardened. Sentencing will be scheduled for next week. Court is adjourned. The gavel struck down with a sharp crack. The gallery erupted into chaos. Reporters surged toward the defense table, microphones and cameras aimed at Taylor. Miss Brooks, Taylor, how does it feel to win the case? Do you think Keller's conviction will lead to broader reform? David stepped toward her. Do you want to say something? Taylor stood slowly. Her gaze swept over the crowd, calm, composed, but sharp as steel beneath the surface. She stepped toward the row of microphones. The cameras zoomed in. My name is Taylor Brooks, Taylor said. I was falsely accused, framed, and nearly destroyed by a man who believed that his badge placed him above the law. He was wrong. Gasps spread through the crowd. Taylor's eyes darkened. But this case was never just about me. It's about a system that allows people like Brian Keller to operate without consequences. That ends today. Reporters shouted over each other. Miss Brooks, Taylor, do you believe other officers were involved? Taylor's gaze sharpened. We know Keller wasn't acting alone, and we intend to find out exactly who protected him. David's brow lifted. We. Taylor smiled faintly. Yes, we. David chuckled. That's bold. Taylor's dark eyes gleamed. Good. Marcus Keene approached from the side of the room, his FBI badge clipped to his belt. He handed Taylor a thin file. Marcus's expression was serious. We traced Keller's financials. He was receiving direct payments from an offshore account tied to a private security firm. David's brow lifted. Whose firm? Marcus's mouth tightened. The company is tied to Senator Charles Whitmore. Taylor's gaze sharpened. Karen Whitmore's father. David's smile faded. Of course. Marcus handed her the file. Whitmore's company has government contracts. Defense. Security. Intelligence. David's expression hardened. That's a dangerous combination. Taylor's smile sharpened. Not for long. Marcus's brow lifted. You want to go after a sitting senator? Taylor's gaze sharpened. Why not? David's smile widened. That's ambitious. Taylor's expression didn't change. Good. Marcus chuckled. The DOJ might not like that. Taylor's dark eyes flashed. They'll survive. David shook his head. So you've taken down Keller, and now you're going after the people who put him there? Taylor's smile was faint. Keller was the weapon, but Whitmore was the hand holding it. Marcus nodded. Whitmore has influence. Taylor's dark eyes glinted. So do I. Marcus smiled faintly. So what's the plan? Taylor's gaze sharpened. We start with the money. David's smile widened. And when Whitmore fights back? Taylor's expression was cold and hard. Then we hit harder. Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. It's the Attorney General's office. They want a statement. Taylor's gaze didn't waver. Tell them they'll get it when I'm finished. Marcus chuckled. You're building a reputation. Taylor's smile sharpened. Good. David leaned toward her. And if they try to stop you? Taylor's dark eyes flashed. They can try. Marcus opened the door as Taylor and David stepped toward the exit. David's smile widened. I'm starting to feel bad for Whitmore. Taylor's smile sharpened. Don't. Marcus followed close behind as Taylor stepped through the doorway. The camera flashes lit up the corridor as reporters shouted her name. David leaned toward her. So what happens now? Taylor's dark gaze sharpened. Now we finish the job. 1 week later, the front page of the New York Times read, Officer Keller sentenced to 10 years for perjury and assault. FBI investigating Senator Whitmore. Below the headline was a photo of Keller in handcuffs, being escorted from the courthouse. Taylor sat in her office, her hands resting lightly on her desk. David sat across from her. David's smile widened. You won. Taylor's eyes darkened. Not yet. David chuckled. And when Whitmore pushes back, Taylor's smile sharpened. Then we push harder. 3 months later, the glass facade of the Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters reflected the bright afternoon sun as Taylor Brooks walked toward the main entrance. The air was crisp, the sharp breeze lifting the edges of her black trench coat. Her heels clicked steadily against the marble floor as she stepped into the secure lobby. Marcus Keene stood by the security desk, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his badge clipped to his belt. He smiled faintly as Taylor approached. Agent Brooks. Taylor's lips curled faintly. Marcus. Marcus handed her a thin black folder. It's done. Taylor's brow lifted. How done? Marcus's smile widened. Keller is serving 10 years. No chance for parole. Taylor's dark eyes gleamed. Good. Marcus's expression sharpened. And Whitmore. Taylor's gaze darkened. We're not done with him. David Langston stepped through the glass doors behind them, a dark overcoat draped over his arm. His smile widened as he approached. You could take a break now. Enjoy the victory. Taylor's brow lifted. And miss the fun? David chuckled. Of course not. Marcus handed Taylor a second file. Paul Whitmore is cooperating. David's smile faded. Excuse me. Marcus nodded. He flipped. The DOJ cut him a deal, partial immunity in exchange for testimony against Senator Charles Whitmore. David's brows lifted. So the father gets sacrificed to protect the son? Marcus smiled faintly. Exactly. Taylor's expression hardened. We're not letting him walk away. Marcus's gaze sharpened. Paul Whitmore is offering to testify that Senator Whitmore knowingly funneled government contract money into offshore accounts and used Keller as a pawn to secure control over police operations. David let out a low whistle. That's enough to bring down the whole system. Marcus's expression darkened. If the DOJ moves forward, it will trigger the largest corruption scandal in state history. Taylor's smile was faint. Then it's time. David's brow lifted. You think they'll fight it? Taylor's gaze sharpened. They'll try. Marcus handed her another folder. Paul Whitmore named names. Taylor opened the folder. Inside were pages of wire transfers, meeting logs, and email exchanges. Senator Whitmore's signature appeared at the bottom of several documents. Taylor's gaze darkened. This isn't just political influence. David leaned over her shoulder. Military contracts. Taylor nodded. Weapons. Surveillance technology. They weren't just protecting Keller. They were testing operational control. Marcus's brow furrowed. Operational control for what? Taylor's eyes narrowed. Domestic response. David's eyes sharpened. You're saying they were preparing to use the police to enforce political objectives? Taylor's mouth curled. Or worse. Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. It's the Attorney General's office. They want a status update. Taylor's gaze sharpened. Tell them to wait. Marcus's smile widened faintly. Yes, ma'am. David leaned toward Taylor. You realize what this means, right? If Senator Whitmore is implicated, it won't stop there. Taylor's gaze darkened. I know. David's smile widened faintly. And you're not concerned? Taylor's expression didn't change. Not even a little. Marcus stepped closer. If this goes public, it could destabilize the state government. Taylor's smile was thin. Good. David chuckled. You're dangerous. Taylor's gaze glinted. That's the point. Marcus's phone buzzed again. He frowned. Federal judge just signed off on the warrant for Whitmore's arrest. David's smile widened. You got him. Taylor's dark eyes sharpened. Almost. David's brow lifted. What's left? Taylor's gaze narrowed. Pressure. Marcus smiled faintly. The DOJ will want to move quietly. Taylor's brow lifted. We won't let them. David leaned closer. You want this public? Taylor's smile widened faintly. Oh, yes. Marcus nodded. We have everything we need. Deposits. Signed contracts. Recorded meetings. Taylor's gaze sharpened. And what about Keller? Marcus's smile darkened. He's already talking. He confirmed that Senator Whitmore ordered him to create false reports and target specific individuals. David's brow lifted. Political targeting? Marcus nodded. Keller admitted that Whitmore used him to gather intelligence on political opponents and activists. Taylor's smile widened faintly. Now we have them. David leaned toward her. So what's next? Taylor's dark eyes flashed. We finished the job. Marcus's phone buzzed. He checked the screen. They're preparing to execute the arrest warrant. Taylor's gaze sharpened. Where is Whitmore now? Marcus's mouth curled. His private estate, 2 miles outside the city. Taylor stood. Tell the team to move. David's brow lifted. You're going with them? Taylor's smile widened faintly. Of course. David's eyes gleamed. And if Whitmore resists? Taylor's gaze sharpened. Then we show him how resistance works. Marcus stepped toward the door. SUV's waiting. Taylor adjusted the cuff of her jacket. Let's go. David followed her toward the door. You know, this is going to make you a target. Taylor's smile sharpened. Let them try. Marcus's mouth curled into a smile. You really don't know how to stop, do you? Taylor's dark eyes gleamed. Why would I stop now? David chuckled. Fair point. Taylor stepped through the glass doors into the sunlight. Marcus and David followed closely behind. A black SUV with tinted windows idled at the curb. Marcus opened the door. Director Brooks. Taylor slid into the back seat. David followed, settling beside her. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat. The driver's voice was calm. Destination? Taylor's dark eyes flashed. Whitmore's estate. The SUV pulled away from the curb, merging into traffic. David's gaze flicked toward her. And if Whitmore fights back? Taylor's smile widened faintly. Then we finish it. David chuckled. Remind me never to get on your bad side. Taylor's dark eyes gleamed. Stay on my side, and you'll be fine. David's smile widened. Deal. The SUV disappeared into the city traffic, heading toward its target. 3 days later, the front page of the New York Times read, Senator Charles Whitmore arrested for corruption and conspiracy. FBI Director Taylor Brooks leads historic takedown. Below the headline was a photo of Taylor standing outside the courthouse, flanked by Marcus and David. Marcus handed Taylor a copy of the paper. You made history. Taylor's smile was faint. Good. David leaned toward her. What's next? Taylor's dark eyes flashed. We clean up the rest. David's brow lifted. And if someone tries to stop you? Taylor's smile widened. Then we push harder.